Hi, thanks for coming to view my presentation today. I'm Jeff Lowe, a Lillian Gilreath postdoctoral fellow in the departments of Chemical Engineering and Chemistry at Purdue University. I work with my advisors Jeff Greeley and Christina Lee. Today I'm going to discuss work I performed with a graduate student in the Lee group at Purdue on using golden nanoparticles to tune the electronic structure of MoS4 ligands for the hydrogen evolution reaction. Before I begin, I would like to mention that I'm a faculty candidate, and this presentation is one of 4 presentations that I have at AICHE this year. There's a faculty candidate poster, one other oral presentation on the work I've been performing in my current postdoc at Purdue, and one other oral presentation from my PhD work at the University of Michigan. I encourage you to check those out to find out more about me and my research. If you would like to reach me to chat more about my research or my qualifications for a faculty opening at your institution, just send me an email. My email address is at the bottom of this slide, and it's also at the end of my talk today. In this work, we looked at the hydrogen evolution reaction, which is an electrochemical means of producing hydrogen. Since it uses electricity to generate hydrogen, it's more renewable than traditional means of hydrogen production, such as steam reforming. The renewable production of hydrogen is often associated with fuel cells, since it can be used directly in fuel cells. And this is very important use of hydrogen. Just last year, China unveiled a new fleet of hydrogen fuel cell powered buses, which will lead to reduced global CO2 emissions. However, as chemical engineers, we understand that hydrogen has a number of other uses, such as in the Haber-Bosch process for ammonia synthesis, which consumes roughly half of the hydrogen produced globally, and in the Fischer-Tropsch reaction to create hydrocarbons for fuels. Thus, if we can make the hydrogen evolution reaction more prevalent, we can greatly reduce our fossil fuel consumption. At the moment, the state-of-the-art catalyst for the hydrogen evolution reaction, or the HER, is platinum. But as many of you likely know, platinum is quite expensive, so there's a large push in the community to go to non-precious metal catalysts. Just over 10 years ago, the Talipin group showed that nanoparticles could be used to bind molecular complexes and thus tailor the properties of the bound complex. For the HER, one of the best known non-precious metal catalysts is a chalcogenide complex. Two-dimensional molybdenum disulfide, or MoS2, was first discovered by Norskopf and co-workers 15 years ago to have high performance for the HER, but only the sulfur sites at the edges are known to be active for the HER. So, more recently, Jaramillo and others used MO3S13 clusters as HER catalysts. Based on their cluster structure, there are more under-coordinated sulfur sites than on 2D MoS2 and more active sites for the HER. They also showed that metal surfaces can be used to tune the electronic structure of the MO3S13 complexes. And just earlier this year, So et al. Used a simpler ligand, MoS4, to generate amorphous MoSX structures as catalysts for the HER, following a similar argument for the creation of undercoordinated sites. Building upon this work, our goal was to use a small, supported nanoparticle with a single monolayer of adsorbed metal chalcogenides to maximize metal support interactions. To achieve a single monolayer, we chose to use the MoS4 ligand, which was used in the previous study, and we supported the ligand on a golden nanoparticle, which we believed could be used to tune the electronic structure of the adsorbed complex, as shown in the study from the Jaramillo group. One of the benefits of choosing this simple MoS4 ligand is that it may allow us to use this ligand to deposit single platinum atoms on a nanoparticle surface in future work, which is attractive from the standpoint of catalyst utilization. Also, if we look at the volcano plot, which allows us to assess catalytic activity versus a single descriptor, we can see that MoS2 and platinum are near the peak in activity, so this approach would allow us to take advantage of 2 of the most active catalysts for the HER. However, MoS4 itself should allow us to achieve high activities for the HER, and this is the focus of the current study. The work I'm discussing today was recently published in ACS Catalysis, actually just a couple of weeks ago, so it's hot off the press. If you want to dig into more of the details of this work, I encourage you to read the paper. So today I'm going to focus on the computational aspects of this work, since that was my role in the project. But I will emphasize how computation and experiment really go hand in hand throughout this study. So to start, let's look at how these complexes were synthesized. The synthesis involves a biphasic ligand exchange reaction between colloidal gold nanoparticles initially capped within a oleoamine ligand. The gold nanoparticles are initially in a nonpolar solvent, hexane, and the precursor tetrathiomolybdate, or NH42-MoS4, in a polar solvent, N-methylformamide, or NMF. The solution is stirred at room temperature and in an atmosphere, and the gold nanoparticles migrate from the nonpolar solvent to the polar solvent. Based on the results from the STEM EDS on the right-hand side of this slide, we can see that the sulfur atoms are patterned to the same positions as the gold nanoparticles, confirming that the complex is localized on the nanoparticle surface. Now let's discuss the goals of the computational work. But before I do that, let me just say that all of the computational work involved DFT calculations using the Vienna ab initio simulation package, or VASP. First, we would like to determine the atomic structure of these MoS4 complexes on the gold nanoparticles to develop a realistic model of the catalyst. Second, we aim to understand how the electronic structure of the MoS4 complexes is modified by the gold nanoparticle surface. And third, to relate these computed atomic and electronic structure effects to catalytic behavior. So to see how these factors influence the hydrogen evolution reaction, basically. Let's begin with the atomic structure. To begin our analysis, we started by looking at the adsorption of a single MoS4 molecule on the gold 111 surface. I have limited my discussion today to the 111 surface since it's the lowest energy model and the most prevalent on the gold nanoparticles. The MoS4 molecule can bind in different geometries and in a variety of sites on the gold surface. We evaluated all of these possible configurations and distilled the results down to the lowest energy structures based on binding geometry. And going from left to right on the slide, we go from monodentate to bidentate to tridentate configurations, and these involve the direct interaction of 1, 2, and 3 sulfur atoms with the gold surface respectively. As you can see, as we go to configurations with more and more interaction between sulfur atoms and the gold surface, we find that binding energies decrease and thus become more and more favorable. So adsorption is more energetically favorable for configurations which maximize the interactions between sulfur atoms and the gold surface. Now let's take a look at higher MoS4 coverages. Here I'm showing adsorption energy per MoS4 species as a function of fractional MoS4 coverage on the x-axis, which is the ratio of MoS4 species to gold atoms in the first surface layer. The single molecule energies were computed at a fractional coverage of 0.125, where there's no interaction among MoS4 species. As we go to higher coverages, we can see that the adsorption energies decrease due to the increased repulsive interactions among MoS4 moieties. Nonetheless, adsorption energies are still negative and thus favorable. Interestingly, we can see that although the tridentate configuration is favored at low coverages, there's a transition point around a coverage of 0.25 where the bidentate configuration becomes favorable. This is due to the fact that the bidentate configuration is able to reduce repulsive interactions relative to that of the tridentate configurations, which become increasingly important as coverage increases. And we can put the measured experimental coverages on this plot, and we see that the range of experimental coverages overlaps with this transition from tridentate to bidentate structures. Note that the range of experimental coverages is due to the fact that we have two sizes of nanoparticles. So the smaller nanoparticle, which is a diameter of around 3 nanometers, has a higher coverage than the larger diameter nanoparticle, which has a diameter of around 9 nanometers. Doing further analysis on these same structures, we can look at average molybdenum-sulfur bond lengths on the left y-axis and average sulfur coordination number on the right y-axis, shown as black and blue curves respectively. We can see that there's a large increase in both metrics right around the coverage where we transition from tridentate to bidentate MoS4 moieties. If we look at these configurations, we see that the structures at higher coverages show evidence of MoS4 polymerization, generating disulfide and bridging molybdenum-sulfur-molybdenum type interactions, which drive these increases in bond lengths and coordination numbers. The measured experimental bond lengths are also shown in this plot, and if we compare it to the computational data, they appear around a fractional coverage of 0.35. So using these data and the data from the previous plot, we can take the structure at a coverage of 0.375 to be the best model for the experimental system. Now we'll move on to the electronic structure analysis. We started by computing the density of states of MoS4 in a non-interacting model system, which we took to be graphene, and shown as black curves on the plots to the left, and compared the results to the MoS4 on gold system, shown as these red filled curves. We did this at two coverages, 0.125, where there's no interaction among MoS4 species, and 0.375, which is a more representative model for the experimental system. We also compared the MoS4 on carbon model to the density of states of free MoS4, which is shown as these dashed yellow lines. What we find is that there is close agreement in the density of states of MoS4 on carbon to that of the free MoS4 case, confirming that there is little interaction with the carbon substrate. More interestingly, there is significant broadening of the density of states for MoS4 on gold at both coverages, suggesting that MoS4 is hybridizing with the gold surface. These results are also consistent with what we see experimentally. In the Zanes analysis, the pre-edge feature, which is initially present in the free complex, disappears when the complex is adsorbed on the surface. The pre-edge feature represents a transition from a filled 1s to an empty 4d orbital, which is forbidden unless there is significant p orbital mixing that's present. This p orbital mixing is present in the free MoS4 molecule, but appears to be broken in the surface adsorbed complex, which is evidence of the molybdenum-sulfur hybridization weakening and the sulfur-gold hybridization forming. We can also look at the infrared spectroscopy as evidence of the distortion of a molecular complex upon binding to the gold surface. In the molecular crystal, MoS bonds are uniform, so only one IR stretching frequency is observed. When MoS4 is adsorbed on the gold surface, there's a split in the two peaks. I'll play this video here. The peaks that shifts to lower frequencies are due to the elongation of MoS bonds towards the surface, which we were able to confirm with computation. And the peaks at higher frequencies are due to the contraction of MoS bonds away from the surface, which we were also able to show with computation. So qualitatively, there is agreement between computation and experiment. Now let's go to the catalytic behavior, which is the last part of the talk. We experimentally measured the HER activity in an acidic electrolyte and then looked at the results normalized by area and mass, and then determined the turnover frequencies. The red and blue curves are for the two sizes of nanoparticles, and the black curve is the MoS4 on carbon control. A system requiring less voltage at a constant current displays higher activity, so we can see that the MoS4 on gold systems significantly outperform the control on carbon. The two nanoparticles of different sizes show roughly the same activity on a per mass basis, and the results for the turnover frequencies are consistent with the other two plots. So it's clear that the electronic structure modification results in improved HER activities. Now, computationally, the most common descriptor to predict HER performance is the free energy of hydrogen binding, or delta GH. From a Sabatier analysis, a catalytic site with a thermoneutral delta GH, or a value close to 0, should give the highest activity for the HER, since that site should be able to effectively adsorb and desorb a hydrogen atom. In the plot to the right, we computed the free energy of hydrogen binding on all of the possible sites in the 0.375 coverage model on gold, shown as the red bars, and compared the results to a suitable reference based on site type. For the most direct comparison to the experimental plot on the previous slide, we can compare these two bars. This gray bar here, which is a terminal sulfur site for MoS4 on carbon, and then the red bar here, which is a bridging sulfur-sulfur site at 0.375 coverage, which is the most active site in this model. The bridging sulfur-sulfur site is significantly more thermoneutral than the MoS4 on carbon reference, demonstrating that the electronic structure modification of MoS4 moieties by the gold surface does indeed improve the HER activity, consistent with the experimental findings. So to summarize, I showed that gold nanoparticles can be used to modify the electronic structure of MoS4 ligands. The binding geometry of MoS4 species on a gold surface varies with surface coverage, with tridentate structures being favored at low coverages and bidentate structures favored at higher coverages. and this electronic structure modification leads to improved performance for the hydrogen evolution reaction. I'd like to thank members of both of my groups, in particular Vimakshi Yadav, who did the majority of the experiments for this work, and to my advisors, Jeff Greeley and Christina Lee, for their support and guidance in these efforts. I would also like to thank the College of Engineering at Purdue for funding my fellowship so that I can explore these interesting challenges, and the Davidson School of Chemical Engineering for conference support. And as a reminder, I've scheduled a simultaneous Q&A and live session if you want to ask me any questions on this work. If so, I look forward to seeing you there. If you aren't able to attend, just send me an email. And thank you very much for viewing my presentation today.